Let's start by looking at this cartoon depicting capitalism. On the right-hand side, you can see a stereotypical capitalist in a business outfit with a top hat. On the left-hand side, you see the workers. The capitalist has a napkin tied around his neck on which the laborers are working on. Equipped with fork and spoon, he expects to be fed by the workers. For me, this is a perfect analogy for capitalism. One capitalist who is living off the labor of many workers. But capitalism hasn't been around since the beginning of time. In today's video, I will talk about the rise of capitalism. My focus lies on the underlying preconditions enabling this rise. I will examine where capitalism is rooted. I start out by showing the historic starting conditions for the rise of capitalism. In the second part, I will outline the first forms of capitalism in order to understand its development. And finally, I will give an overview of the effects of Industrial Revolution and the era of manufacturing, which have accelerated the rise of capitalism. So let's start by examining the historic developments enabling the rise of capitalism. Previous to capitalism, the feudal society was the predominant form. In the medieval age, there were peasants working on the lands of feudal lords, who were ruling over them. In exchange for the permission to work and live on the lands of the feudal lords, the peasants had to hand over part of their produce to the feudal lord. The rest could be used for their personal food supply or to trade with craftsmen. This happened mainly on a local and regional level, creating self-supporting microeconomies. In the medieval city, production was carried out by master craftsmen. Contrary to capitalism, each craftsman owned his tools to produce specific products in their workshops, together with their family and their assistants. Therefore, they became highly skilled in their respective tasks. In order to limit competition and regulate the market, they organized in guilds to set standards and prices of goods, creating a kind of monopoly, making them a powerful force in medieval times. The feudal state of society began to vanish with the rise of the merchant class starting in the 16th century. The severe restrictions on outside trade were relaxed and enabled the emergence of a new class of merchants. What were these merchants doing? They bought cheap products abroad, then sold them with huge profits in Europe and therefore created massive fortunes for themselves. The countries themselves also profited from this by receiving significant parts of these profits as taxes, leading inevitably to the global fight over colonies to enlarge the share of trade for each country. The rise of merchants therefore also marks the emergence of capitalism. Let's take a look at the first forms of capitalism, which emerged in the 17th century. Traditionally, the merchants were the link between consumer and the producer. But this changed as the merchants started to take over control of the producer. It began by placing orders and paying them in advance, supplying them with raw materials, and then even paying a wage for the work done in producing a finished good. Especially this introduction of wage labor is a crucial development in the rise of capitalism. This marks the shift from merchants towards capitalists, as they were no longer making money off trade, but of the ownership and the control of the means of production. This first became apparent in the cottage production, which is also marking the beginning of a new method of production typical for capitalism. Personal homes became something like micro-factories, like you can see here in this picture. These were coordinated by the capitalist and produced directly for them. It marked the beginning of mass production as a trigger for the Industrial Revolution, ultimately leading into capitalistic society we live in today. So, when the Industrial Revolution happened, the same workshop you have just seen on the previous slide now looks something like this. Production is no longer happening at home, but in large-scale factories. Technical inventions transformed the primitive factory system and machines increased the overall productivity. Former regulations and guidelines for the production imposed by guilds were demolished. Free markets were set as new guiding star to enable the brutal exploitation of wage laborers by the capitalists. Most notably, Adam Smith's famous book, The Wealth of Nations, helped to spread the idea of laissez-faire markets without governmental interference. The invention of the steam engine was the final tipping point to set the Industrial Revolution off. Human power was no longer required, leading to massive gains in efficiency. Additionally, the split of work processes into several subparts called division of labor enabled even bigger gains. The increased productivity required new sales markets as the own population was quickly fully satisfied with their demands. This led to the change of the old doctrine of protectionism, which was no longer seen as favorable. The rise of capitalism goes hand in hand with the rise of free trade. So, let's sum up the main reasons for the rise of capitalism. The breakdown of feudalism as predominant mode of society enabled the rise of a new social and economical system. This system was based on wage labor, meaning the shift of ownership of the means of production towards the capitalist. Finally, the Industrial Revolution was enabled by these changes, which accelerated the process of the rise of the capitalist system we live in today.